Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. What is the ceiling for the South Carolina Gamecocks heading into 2025? I think most South Carolina fans know this already. The ceiling is astronomically high. I mean, it is a legit contender in the college football playoffs. I would argue that the version of South Carolina that we saw in the end of November to finish out the 2024 year, that was the ceiling of a South Carolina team that I don't think a lot of teams wanted to see in the college football playoffs. And then you take a look at the team going into 2025, it's a lot of young talent that's just developing and getting better within this South Carolina program. Look, we know the South Carolina ceiling is high. Now we got to take a look at what needs to happen for South Carolina to reach that ceiling in the 2025 year. It's almost like a wish list here of stuff I want to talk about in terms of what South Carolina needs to do to kind of reach their potential. Fired up to get into it. Before we do, and as always, to the South Carolina fans, it's been real fun talking this program in the transfer portal, on the recruiting trail to close out 2024. The amount of support y'all have shown the fellas has been absolutely amazing. Cannot thank you guys enough. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Much more importantly, let it fly in the comment section. I mean, we're having this conversation awfully early in the offseason, but this is going to kind of set the stage in terms of what we're talking about in spring practice going into fall camp. Appreciate you guys. Without further ado, let's get into it. And you make no mistake about it. It starts with LaNorris Sellers. And can he kind of take off where he left off in the 2024 year? Because that version of LaNorris Sellers that we saw in the month of November, that is a difference maker at the quarterback spot. And when you have a difference maker at quarterback, you can really be a good team in the landscape of college football. Can he get better going into 2025? That's probably the biggest question mark. And one thing that should make you feel really good about LaNorris Sellers getting better in 2025 is what he has around him. I don't think it's a coincidence that LaNorris Sellers started playing his best football when Nick Harbor started playing his best football and when the offensive line significantly improved throughout the course of 2024. But LaNorris Sellers as a football player, I mean, you start talking about what he brings to the South Carolina offense. Number one, first and foremost, he was a lot cleaner with the football. I mean, since that Alabama game, the last 7 games that we saw from LaNorris Sellers, he threw 14 touchdowns, only threw 3 interceptions. And so he was starting to make those difference-making plays that we all know he can do, but he's also keeping the ball out of harm's way, which was a little bit of a problem for LaNorris Sellers early on in 2024, which was to be expected from a redshirt freshman quarterback. The second thing that you noticed LaNorris Sellers really bring to the table that I thought really elevated his game is we all knew LaNorris Sellers was a freaky athlete when he decides to use his legs, right? In fact, I don't think a lot of South Carolina fans probably know this, but he had more missed tackles forced at carrying the football than Rocket Sanders had. Rocket Sanders was awesome for South Carolina in 2024. That kind of shows how much of a difference maker LaNorris Sellers was being an athlete at the quarterback spot. Now, the thing that you really took notice of is we all knew he was a good athlete. He started being able to use his athleticism probably in the more right spots. And I guess the best way to phrase that is he became more comfortable in terms of, hey, when do I sit in the pocket and deliver footballs down the field? And when do I get out of the pocket and go use my athleticism? I felt like early on in 2024, this is probably correlated with the offensive line struggling early. He was a little bit hesitant to kind of use his legs and when it was the right time to do so. Back half of 2024, I thought he blended it really well. Say, hey, when I have a clean pocket, I'm stepping up and delivering footballs down the field. But when it's muddy, I can go be a game changer. And he started kind of using it at the right time. And so you look at LaNorris Sellers, if he takes that jump, and again, you kind of expect the supporting cast around him to be a little bit better, this kid can be a difference maker in the 2025 season. Number 2, and this might be a hot take for a lot of South Carolina fans, but you start talking about where I think the ceiling is for South Carolina and what it looks like. This offensive line is a strength in the 2025 year. It's not just good. I'm talking about it being a strength for South Carolina in the 2025 year. I think there is reason to believe that this happens. You look at Josiah Thompson, last 3 games starting at left tackle, only gave up 3 pressures, 1 quarterback sack. You look at Casey Henry at the right tackle spot, only 1 sack, 2 quarterback pressures. This offensive line was playing some dang good football towards the end of the 2024 season, and they're only getting better. right? Josiah Thompson, Case and Henry. I think the best version of South Carolina's offensive line probably includes a guy like Tree kicking into the inside and playing one of the guard spots. You're bringing Boaz Stanley kind of plug and play at the center position. Why is this so important to South Carolina? Really for two reasons. One, when LaNorris Sellers was kept clean in the 2024 season, which really didn't happen all that much until the end of November, but when he was kept clean on the year, 71% completion percentage, 14 touchdowns to 2 interceptions. How about LaNorris Sellers working off play action? Because when you're talking about the offensive line, yeah, you start with pass protecting the quarterback, but you also want an offensive line that can get the run game going. When the run game started to work and South Carolina was able to go off play action, LaNorris Sellers off of play action, 70% completion percentage, 10 touchdowns to 0 interceptions. I don't think it's a coincidence, again, that when the offensive line started playing better and South Carolina started running the football better, you started seeing the best version of LaNorris Sellers. I look at the offensive line and say it's a nice blend of youth that's getting better. Guys like Josiah Thompson, guys like Tree, guys like Trevon Baugh, and then you're bringing some plug and play guys as kind of experience on the inside. This is the year where Shane Beamer's done a really nice job, kind of stockpiling talent from the high school ranks on the offensive line. And there were kind of some growing pains in the last 2 years because you kind of had a young offensive line that you were leaning on. I'll look at it in 2025 and say, this is the year this offensive line and all that work that Shane Beamer's been putting in on the recruiting trail to develop this offensive line and build it could pay off in 2025. Last one, Nick Harbor, wide receiver 1. This was probably the biggest talking point we all talked about for South Carolina in the transfer portal. And South Carolina kicked around a few wide receivers in the portal. They never really got into any bidding wars, and they never really got super aggressive with wide receivers. I think part of that is, look, we like what we have on our roster. And Nick Harbor's that guy that, you go back to South Carolina in the 2024 year, they didn't really have that wide receiver 1 until Nick Harbor started putting it together later in the season. I mean, their pass catcher number 1 was Joshua Simon at the tight end spot. I mean, he led him in targets, led him in touchdowns, led him in receiving yards. The wide receiver play probably had a little left to be desired in the 2024 year. But the common theme with this wide receiver room is it's a lot of young guys who are getting better. I think it starts with Nick Harbor emerging as that wide receiver 1, which we all know, like the capability of this kid is certainly wide receiver 1-esque. Mazio Bennett at the slot. And then what about the true freshman coming in? You're already hearing good things about Brian Rowe. I love Donovan Murph. Malik Clark's another big body that runs sub-11 in the 100-meter dash. There's some talent, and we've seen across the country, like wide receivers coming in year 1 having a really big impact. Can one or two of those guys really emerge in this wide receiver room as well? I think when you talk about ceiling of South Carolina, you talk about guys like Nick Harbor reaching their ceiling in 2025. On the defensive side of the football, that to me is where you have more question marks. I look at this offense and say I'm optimistic about LaNorris Sellers taking a step. I think the offensive line can be a dang good unit. You're really optimistic about some of the young pass catchers. Can the defense that was really just elite for South Carolina in the 2024 year, can it at least hold serve? And I think the first starting point here is the inside of the defensive line. I mean, you're losing guys like TJ Sanders, who might go in the first round of the NFL draft, played almost 500 snaps. You're losing a guy like Tonka Hemingway, played over 500 snaps. You're losing a guy like Huntley as well, played 385 snaps. So it's a lot of really good players and a lot of snaps that you're losing on the inside of the defensive line. Now, South Carolina brings in JUCO Xavier Hardy. You're bringing a guy like Gabriel Brown-Ladindi. You're bringing a guy like Devontae Miles from Bowling Green, who will kind of see what he looks like in an SEC football landscape. Can you have these guys emerge? Can you have a guy like Gabriel Brown-Ladindi emerge as a really quality option on the inside of the defensive line? That's probably where you start. And I expect this to be a position where Shane Beamer's going into spring practice with that position group being a question mark and saying, all right, what do we look like in spring practice? Is a guy like Gabriel Brown-Ladindi staying healthy and looking like he can play at an SEC level? Can Xavier Hardy make the jump from JUCO to the SEC level? If the answer is no, this is the position I would expect South Carolina to look in the spring transfer portal window, and probably you haven't seen South Carolina get into a ton of bidding wars. If there's a big name that pops on the inside of the defensive line, I would expect South Carolina to pursue it in a big way. Second question is, we're talking about South Carolina reaching their potential, reaching their ceiling in 2025. You talk about these linebackers playing like the freak show athletes they are. Most notably Fred Johnson and Justin Okoronkwo. You won't find many linebackers across the country that have higher ceilings as linebackers than these two guys. Both going into year two, both kind of played a little bit. Justin at Alabama, Fred Johnson for South Carolina last year, but are largely not proven commodities. Talk about the two questions you have. It's on the inside of the defensive line and the off-ball linebacker position. The off-ball linebacker position, you have two potential massive answers if Fred Johnson or Justin O kind of reach their potential. And you start talking about ceiling, it's guys like Fred Johnson and Justin putting it together. And then I think lastly, just the pass rush holding serve from 2024. I mean, you lose Kyle Kennard, you lose TJ Sanders. What made this South Carolina defense so special in the 2024 years, their ability to get after the passer with the front four. And South Carolina fans were spot on with this conversation 12 months ago. I was very critical of the South Carolina secondary coming out of the 2023 season. A lot of y'all in the comment section were like, yeah, the secondary wasn't the problem. The pass rush was. If you can't get to the quarterback, the secondary can only hold up in coverage for so long. Y'all were absolutely right. Because when this pass rush emerged in 2024, it went from one of the worst in the SEC to one of the best in the SEC. All of a sudden, the secondary starts to look a heck of a lot better, too. I think that's the storyline. You look at that South Carolina secondary, and yeah, you lose some really good football players, but you also bring in a couple of good football players like Brandon Sissy, and you bring some guys back like Judge and Jalen. I look at it and say, I don't have question marks about the secondary. I have question marks about this pass rush, absent Kyle Kennard, absent TJ Sanders, being that elite unit that we saw in 2024. Because if you can, and a guy like Dylan Stewart just continues to get better, a guy like Jalen Brown hits in the transfer portal from Missouri, Brian Thomas, a guy that I've always liked for South Carolina, emerges as a difference maker. I ain't worried about the secondary. The conversation here is, can this pass rush hold serve? I mean, you sacked the quarterback 9.2% of the time last year. That was top 5 in the country. Had 154 quarterback pressures. That's elite pass rush play. Can we get that in 2025? If you get these things, y'all better watch out for South Carolina, because this team can be an extremely dangerous football team in the 2025 year. And there's a lot more answers than questions for South Carolina. You go back to how we talked about South Carolina going into 2024. It's like, this is going to be a fun team, but there are a lot of question marks too. You're starting redshirt freshman LaNorris Sellers. You're going to start a true freshman in Josiah Thompson at left tackle. There were a lot of question marks, and those question marks kind of got answered as the season went on. You're going into 2025. You still have question marks, but there's a lot more answers to these questions than we had 12 months ago. And that culture that Shane Beamer's building, that's kind of the X factor here. The player development and culture, it's been damn good for South Carolina. We'll see what it looks like in 2025. These are the things that we're going to be looking for as spring practice gets started, as we roll into fall camp. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.